I'd like to introduce Mr. Chuck Laur. Mr. Laur is the president of Peregrine Properties Limited in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They are currently exploring the development of a space business park. Mr. Laur.
The idea here, this happened in the last conference we were talking about, where we ended up talking about the legal and regulatory and financial side before we were talking about the physical end of the project. So I want to take a couple minutes and give you some idea of what it is we're talking about before how we make money at it. This may seem familiar to well, that's as good as we get. This may seem familiar to some of you. Lots of great parts and pieces in this assembly, and I think everything in here is either being made right now or complete or fully in the computer, ready to be fabricated. So all of these parts and pieces I assumed would be available to purchase at a later date once this is up and running and there's an operational history to establish this commercially, in order to do things like talk to insurance companies about what is the liability rates for having people come up there that aren't professional astronauts and such. So the premise here is that this is up, it's running, it has a safe operational history, and the X-33 RLV program is far enough down the road that the drop-in launch price from the $4,000 to $5,000 a pound to the $400 to $500 a pound is in fact a bankable business assumption. And based on that, we ended up with a design. This originated at a charrette, which is a one-day intensive workshop. At the University of Washington back in February last year. And what we did was look at what can you do with the parts and pieces of the ISS program, and how can you do something that is truly commercial with all of this great hardware that has production lines now up and running. What we did was made a decision to get away from the main truss, all of the outdoor stuff, so to speak, and deal more with inside volume. So what we have is a vertically oriented facility as opposed to the horizontal flyer on ISS, and primarily for ease of docking and also for providing gravity gradient stabilization. What this is, the lower half of it here, these 5 modules are the people spaces, which includes 2 modules for tourists, 1 module for the staff, logistics, and the lower, nobody saw that little Hilton logo there, right? The lower module is the equivalent of the hotel atrium. The commons module is what we're calling it. The upper half of the facility is the other half of the mixed-use environment, which is the research and manufacturing. The idea here is that you have 2 multi-tenant R&D modules, which are the basic rack-type system for people that are not prepared to make a commitment to a full module's worth of space. And then the horizontal constellation out in here would be single-tenant dedicated manufacturing modules, where a company that has proven out a process and saying, all right, we're prepared to make a capital investment, we want to sign a 5-year lease or a 10-year lease, and because if you're investing hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in the intensive equipment that goes inside one of these cans, you want to have a long-term stable business environment where you know what your costs are and you deal with the private sector as opposed to the government sector. And then all your power and thermal is up top with this truss assembly here. So that's the physical facility. When you look at some of the graphs of the CSTS study, and you look at your locker rack pricing, you're dealing with variations that are 1 or 2 orders of magnitude between your least and most costly. When you take the midpoint, you look and say, yeah, this does have the potential to make some money. This is where we were last year at the CSTS design charrette process. We've got an overall cash flow stream that meets the threshold investment rate of a 20% internal rate of return. A couple people have talked about that in other sessions in here, but I think it's real important to understand what we're dealing with here. The time value, the time meter is running on the dollars as soon as the check is written, and in order to achieve a 20% internal rate of return, the raw numbers are several times that, because the money in the out years is only worth 10% to 30% of the dollars going in, so the profits out here have got to be 2 or 3 times what just a straight CD rate would be equivalently. But as soon as I looked at this and say, all right, here, this one is set up as a 2-stage deal where the research and manufacturing goes in here, and the tourists come in a couple of years later, so you check out the system, get the reliability of the vehicles, so it's firmly in place so that you can get your insurance rating, so that you can do amateur tourists. And as soon as I looked at this as soon as I looked at this graph, I go, this is a graph of an unleveraged or all-cash REIT. A REIT is a real estate financing mechanism that came in place, when the bank cut off the money supply in 1989. People like me had to find alternate sources of capital, and the buzzword in my industry a few years ago was securitization of the real estate industry. And when you look at this is exactly how an all-cash REIT would look at buying a shopping center or a big high-rise office building and say, all right, here's $100 million, we're just going to pay for it all cash, we don't want to deal with risk of leverage, because if you borrow money, that's a fixed cost, and if your vacancies go up or your operating expenses go up, then you lose that spread and you potentially can lose money. In the Wall Street world, all cash deals are perceived as less risky because, oh well, it goes down a little bit, but you never go negative. You're always getting something back because it's all your own cash. And so you look at this as an all-cash real estate investment trust or securitization type offering and say, yeah, this makes sense. The other thing it points out is something that is not widely talked about in the space advocacy community, which is dealing with the spread. Here's your gross income, here's your operating expenses. This margin right here is where you make your money, and you have to be able to confidently predict this 15 or 20% margin in through here in order to get anybody to predict. It's very, very common in my industry. Everybody always looks at operating expenses, and the term that we use is called net operating income. Everybody needs to know what this NOI is going to be here, because all of the financial calculations are based on what that net operating income is. That was the basis of looking at it on, you're not going to be able to see much about this. But I then took this the next step, which was not to look at it on an all-cash checkbook sort of thing, and look at how I would do a deal as a straight real estate play. Now, in my industry, we don't look at the checkbook form of accounting where just dollars in, dollars out, what's the cumulative IRR. We capitalize all of the costs and run it out, so you assume you've got your projections right here, your income starts. In this case, I optimized it for a 1-year construction period and full lease out thereafter, and the launch cost of $500 a pound, the modules are based on what we believe the production run pricing of the standard station modules would be. The soft costs is another term that you guys probably are not aware of. The nearest analogy would be the DDT&E, which the aerospace folks know about. The people like me that actually put the deal together also have our load, which is right up in here, with the soft costs, fees, financing, leasing commissions, construction period interest, and I just put in a plug number of 25% as a return, just to get some idea of the sensitivity. It also gets into some tax aspects, which we are trying to take a more aggressive position on now. As we went through and looked at it, the conclusion that we came to was that this thing may be a multi-billion-dollar project. It's effectively the equivalent of a high-rise building because this is about 300 feet or so. But we're taking the position for tax code purposes that it's not real estate, it's personal property. Therefore, under U.S. tax code, if you assume that this is owned by a U.S. company, it is run under U.S. tax code, you can write off this whole investment in 5 years. And I mean, these are not trivial matters, and there's no way that we would you have the investor put this on his 1040 without a ruling from the IRS in advance that in fact is the treatment. But it's these, the minutia of the Internal Revenue Code is a big part of how all this stuff works. And looking at, one other thing. I also, just because I somewhat believe in leverage, I've got this as a 50-50 deal. Out of the $1.5 billion in here, I've got 50% debt, 50% equity, and I'm amortizing the principal over 15 years just to see what it looked like. I mean, part of the analysis you go through and you vary all these assumptions one at a time and see what it does to your returns. But when you go through and look at this is a conventional real estate analysis. And the way I calculate my internal rate of returns, I look at how they change every year, and I'm dealing with 20 to 25% internal rate of returns on a 50-50 leverage basis. Now, whether I could ever get a commitment for doing that at the moment, probably not. The other thing that is different about real estate from aerospace is that when something is used up, in aerospace you get $1 a pound for the scrap aluminum and it goes back into the system. In real estate, you typically don't throw things away with zero residual value. And so I've assumed that at some point in the future, this thing is a stable, income-producing property. It has a generating cash flow that auditors can come in and verify. All income properties trade just about exclusively on what is the return. It's effectively a price-to-earnings ratio. In my industry, it's called the capitalization rate, which is effectively the same thing. So based on the earnings taken in a given year, you have a certain sales price and a certain return on investment. That is posted into the back end of the calculations, and that effectively bumps your returns up from the operating returns by 5 or 6%. If you again remember what an IRR curve looks like, that stuff 15 years out doesn't have a big impact on the overall returns, but it takes a 20% return to a 25% return by doubling or tripling your investment out here. This then gets into the practical side of things. If my universe begins in the year 2005 plus, because A, I've got to wait for station to be up and running, and B, we've got to have X-33 flying and RLV in the certification process before anybody's going to take me seriously, then what can I do in these 10 years? And so this is from a hypothetical basis. Say, what if we have the simpler version, the all-cash deal, where we had a maximum negative cash flow of about $500 million on $1.5 billion or so of investment? What could happen if somebody like Rupert Murdoch or Ed Bass or somebody like that says, hey, this is a great idea. What can I do to help? Well, give me $150 million right now, 1995, and put this into effectively a mutual fund reinvest all of the returns and get somebody like a Dreyfus or a Fidelity, or split it up into 2 or 3 Class A mutual fund managers and let this thing compound over the 10 years so that when you have to write that check for the $500 million to actually get the thing going out in here, you've taken the $150 million investment, and depending on how good your mutual fund manager is, the midpoint of the range gets it to you right here. If you have, if the Dreyfus returns where they're showing the 15–20% over 20 years can repeat for the next 10 years, potentially you can pay for your facility and have as much left over as you invested. The same thing also applies with a few less zeros to the tourist component of this, because in this facility we have a total of 24 tourist spots. It's 12 double occupancy staterooms. The standard of hotel is always double occupancy. You can, I think, make a reasonable case that most of the high-end tourists would be coming up as couples of one sort or another. And so what, if you look at the same ramp up, except you're a few years further down the road here, because you've got to get the certification of the facility with the manufacturing customers in place, and you look at the high side of what we think this is going to be, which is neighborhood of $500,000 per person ticket price. Somebody that wants to take a proactive position, let's say their 10th year anniversary now, and they want to have their 25th anniversary in a low Earth orbit hotel. Somebody putting up about $75,000 right now and letting that same thing compound would have their ticket price paid for going in. And the idea of having again, a mutual fund with a very tight set of escrow instructions so that the people that put the money up in here know if this thing never gets built, the worst that we get is we get our money back. I mean, you can't touch this money. This is the concept of escrowed and contingent performance-based agreements is very, very common in my industry. All you can do is point to it as the best market research in the world. If I have 500 sales to make a year to sell out the Leo Hotel, 1,000 rooms, 500 couples booking 10-day stays in low Earth orbit, and the market research says, yeah, this works, but our survey stuff has 1 or 2 orders of magnitude potential variation in the market. Market research with people with deposits in hand and the first year or 2 of the hotel sold out will be about the best thing you can do to show to a bank. If we get a little more aggressive in the pricing, then we end up delivering more in the $250,000, $300,000 price range, which some of the analyses indicate that it might be more here than here. A $50,000 investment this year confirms your reservation for the year 2010. These are, of course, hypothetical. We are not soliciting any investments at this point under SEC laws, but as a financial exercise, it shows that you can construct a financial business plan that gets you from here to there, assuming A, you have station, you have the operational history that will satisfy the lenders and the underwriters and the insurance folks, and B, you have a $500 pound vehicle. Given those 2 assumptions, the rest of it is a marketing and finance game, and me or people like me are the sort of people that need to be brought into the equation in order to start setting these things up. Curious here, this is called International Space Development Conference. If you isolate the 2 core of that and say space development, people on Earth that do development are called developers. Who in this room would consider themselves to be a professional real estate developer? That's a big outreach problem. I mean, people like me like working on deals. I mean, it's the nature of the the type of people that gravitate into this industry. It's a small and very entrepreneurial. One of the things that people in the NSS and people that attend this conference, and most people know at least 1 or 2 real estate developers and saying, hey, have you ever heard about this? No. I mean, to me, it's a good outreach effort. Yes?
Do you think if you went to a conference full of real estate developers and you showed this to them, do you think they'd laugh you out of the room, or do you think they'd be interested enough that a few of them at least would want to pursue it?
The latter. I mean, I've floated a few trial balloons already. The big thing is the 10 years. And the people run through these numbers and say, okay, we've got confirmation on some aspects of this. The goals of price per pound are very much in the minds of the people that are working on X33 RLB. Put those 2 assumptions just aside for the moment and say, yeah, this is great, but what can we do between now and 10 years from now to try and ramp this up and give it a little more credibility? And in fact, that is what we're talking to with some people right now, is to try and figure out a bridging mechanism that can use current space vehicles and facilities to get the manufacturing and the research side committed up front. I mean, if we had 10-year leases with Intel and Merck and Pfizer to lock up the manufacturing side of that, and we had letters of intent from those people in the next year, hey, 10 years is not a long period of time in my industry. The business park that I developed in Ann Arbor started in 1985, and we're maybe halfway done. I mean, we work on very long cycles. And typically it takes you 5 or 10 years to put a deal together that's of any size. You run it for another 10 or 20 years after that, and you access long-term capital as opposed to the short-term, what are your profits on the next quarter kind of capital. Let's see, I can take a couple more questions. I guess not. Anybody else?
Well, what are you going to be doing next?
Well, I mean, this is more of an academic program for me at the moment, because things like getting X33 funded, getting the first elements of the station launched are sort of square one for me. But the first elements of the station launch in 2 years. The first leg of X33 starts flying in, what, 97? So, there'll be things that you can get video clips of and say, here are parts and pieces that are happening. The next couple of years, talk it up at conferences and things like that, but to me, long term, this is something that I intend to do, and just push it out and keep working on the business plan, and ultimately something happens. Bob?
Yeah.
Could you go over just a little bit about internal rate of return and how you figure this stuff out? I don't know if you'll get into too much detail. But,
just a little bit more. I can find the chart quickly here. Might not be it. Oh, there it is. Net present value and internal rate of return are effectively the same thing. The definition of internal rate of return is the discount rate that brings the net present value of the future cash flow stream to 0. That tells you a lot, I know. But if you look at it the other way around and say, here's my investment year one, and in order to have that dollar come back to me at an equivalent buying power, effectively, you pick a particular discount rate and say, all right, what is the accepted value? I mean, this is just kind of a consensus thing in the investment community that's built up over the years, and with the advent of personal computers, it actually became easy to do this at IRR cash flow stream, and you get it. But effectively what happens is once you're out to about 10 years, your dollar, the investment dollar, comes back to you at 40 to 50% of its original value. When you come out to here, you've dropped from 100% to 50% to 10, 12, 20% out in here. So to get To have a dollar give you a 20% IRR, if you don't get anything for 20 years, you have to have a raw return of 300 or 400% in order to have that boil back to a present value that gives you your original investment plus your hurdle rate that you need to have in order to get the investment up front. That's why the dollars, you need to get your cash flow going as early as possible. You need to get as much of it in this year because you can have fairly wide swings out in here, and it only deals with your total returns by a point. When you look at this on a spreadsheet and you start doing variables and graphing them, you can see that the fairly large flops in this area here are not as important as getting it right in the first 5 years here. Yes?
These are for standard risks that investment bankers would support. What about for more risky types of operations where you have a potentially greater return and not necessarily as much chance of getting your money back?
You're not going to raise billions of dollars unless the returns are, or unless the risks are quantifiable. For me to actually go and get a commitment for $1.5 billion to build something like this without the physical components, a hard contract from Boeing and McDonnell Douglas and those folks, yeah, we'll sell you these parts and pieces, and this vehicle will get them up there and put them all together for you. If you don't have those two things, it's an academic exercise. Given that, the risk spread that you're talking about is factored into the 20 to 25% internal rate of return. Typical, you take your National Credit Mall, your 20-year lease with General Motors for a manufacturing plant, those kind of deals generally have returns that are in the 8, 10, 12% range. That's your typical pension fund type investment. The pension funds will also invest in hotels and casinos and things like that, and what I'm dealing with is the high end of the large scale real estate investment, which things like Luxor that cost $400 million or Trump's Atlantic City stuff. I mean, that's the people that do those kind of deals are the people that would be dealing with this, and those guys look at 20% plus. That's where the numbers came from.
You made an assumption that the parts from ISO would be available and the lines would be up and running.
Right.
That's not really going to be the case. With most projects of this type, there are going to be companies that are going to be created simply to build parts for the station. Once it's built, they're going to be closed out. The lines are going to be shut down. You're going to have to retool everything at any time after the construction. Has that been figured out into the cost?
No. I mean, I'm not the person to ask on that. The afternoon session on the commercial space marketplace is we ask those guys. Yes.
One thing that has been mentioned is that MACDAC has not been willing to move ahead on the Delta Trip on its own. It's waiting for funding and so on from the government. No, it's not willing to go ahead. And they're saying, well, we can't afford to put the money out because, you know, we can have it all go down the drain. And therefore, we're not going to do it. Well, of course, we understand differently. But if we had, for example, you kind of people, but particularly you, of course, get together with some of these people, like, for example, MACDAC people, and say, we will give you an order for, you know, X amount over a period of time. You get them ready.
Right.
You see, and ask for the money, so I know it's you're serious. Mm-hmm. Then they'd be willing to go ahead without waiting for the government to get their, you know, lines in here. So that would help somewhat there. Then he has a very good point, is that, for example, we cannot do an Apollo Era program. The lines were shut down long ago, and it would take longer than it took them to get the lines put up again. So you'd have to go to these companies and say, do not close down your lines when you finish doing this. In fact, go ahead and get started now, you know, or again, we'll give you an order, put some money in escrow to show we're serious, and then they would not have to close down and be happy to stay in business.
Right.
So are you in a position to see that this would be something you could do, given if you could get all the factors put together?
Well, that's why I'm here. I mean, you know, both talking to people like you, and ultimately we need to talk to the Congress critters about stuff like this. I mean, if station costs $17 billion and what I'm talking about is $1.5 billion, that is the best case in the world that the incremental growth of a market beyond those first parts and pieces is where the long-term benefit to the country is. And I mean, on the conservative to median side of the market, there could be 3 or 4 of this type of facility up there co-orbiting or within a short commute, metaphorically speaking, of ISS, and you have a conventional orbital real estate infrastructure.
Right.
You have places to stay, places to book hotel rooms, places to get to lodge your workers that are up there on the 60 to 90-day rotations, manufacturing space, all of that stuff in a conventional commercial environment. I mean, that's where the big play is.
That's right.
And so that's what we're trying to get the message out now for.
That's great.
Yeah, okay.
That's what happened.
Okay. Joyce.
Well, I was going to say that Chuck has been doing his job and talking to the people who are going to put this up. And it's not an easy task, because lots of people have to be convinced, lots of boards of directors have to be convinced, lots of financiers and investment people have to be convinced. So he's been out doing the legwork for many years, and it's not like it's not happening. It's that it's a long process, it's a tedious process.
That's great, thank you.
Excellent talk. If you want to ask Chuck some questions, please go ahead and ask him in a little while, because what has happened here is Chuck and Alex decided they wanted to hear each other's talk. Unfortunately, they were scheduled at the exact same time, just across the hall from each other. So they decided to get together. Here we are, which is the happy accident here is that we've doubled both of their audiences. It's always more fun to talk to a big audience. And